Well, greetings everyone. I'd like to welcome you to Seattle Foundation's session today on the topic of family storytelling, powerful tools for raising happy, resilient children. We are so glad that you could join us for this discussion. And if you know folks who may be interested in this topic and weren't able to take part today, we will be recording today's session and make a link available on Seattle Foundation's website in the coming weeks. So you can certainly share it with other folks. I'm Lauren Domino. I work as a philanthropic advisor at Seattle Foundation. In my role, I have the joy of working with families to help them discover their shared values, often through telling stories, so that they can work collaboratively in their philanthropic and community-focused efforts. We are honored to have Dr. Marshall Duke join us for today's session from his home base in Emory University in Atlanta. I'll be sharing more with you about Marshall momentarily, but first I wanted to give you a quick orientation to the session and to this platform. So to kick things off, I would love to get to know you all a little bit better and get a sense of who's in the room. So I'm going to issue a little poll here. You should see it on the right-hand side of your screen momentarily. If you just want to take a minute and let us know who you are, we'll get a sense of who's out there. So go ahead and click on one of the options. We should start to get a sense. They're coming in. Wonderful. What a fantastic range of folks we have here today. You're welcome to keep taking that poll. So to our philanthropic partners and family members out there, we hope that this session will inspire you with some great ideas for engaging your family in sharing stories and strengthening ties. To our professional advisor colleagues, we hope today's session strengthens your own practice with families as you work to deepen relationships and support your clients' success. And to everyone else out there, thank you again for making time for the session today, and we hope you have some great takeaways. So, to help you all get the most out of today's session, we encourage you to ask lots of questions. You should see this chat box on the right-hand side of your screen. You are all on audio mute, so we can't hear you, so please do type your questions in this box. We've reserved some dedicated time at the end of the session for questions and answers, but feel free to ask questions throughout. You can give this a try now. If everyone wants to just give me a little shout out in the chat box, maybe let us know where you're joining us from today. So if you're from Seattle or East Side or somewhere far away, everyone give it a chat box. So we've got Xander, hello, Mercer Island, Seattle, downtown, Kenmore. Fantastic. Thanks for giving that a try. I'm glad it's all working for you. I wanted to let you know as well that the chat box is not going to appear in the recording of this session, so your anonymity will be preserved. When we release this to our web, the chat box will be private. So I also wanted to let you know that at the top of your screen you should see a little person with a hand raised. There are some options in a drop-down menu there, so if you're having trouble hearing us, if I'm talking too quickly, you can let us know. There's even, I think, an applause feature, so if I just do something awesome and you want me to know about that, please feel free to give me some applause. Or Marshall, for that matter. Seattle Foundation is just honored to host Marshall for today's session on family storytelling. As many of you know, Seattle Foundation's mission is to ignite powerful, rewarding philanthropy to make Greater Seattle a stronger, more vibrant community for all. We are ranked in the top 25 community foundations across the U.S. by total asset size. Actually, just last December, we crested over the $1 billion mark, which was a big deal. So that's a little bit about us. Seattle Foundation has a deep commitment to family philanthropy and intergenerational giving. We are recognized across the country and have been leading the field in how to effectively approach this work. We've developed tools that help families identify individual and shared values. We curate spaces for family meetings and site visits that demonstrate values in action. And of course, we host great learning opportunities like today's session. So we had the pleasure of hosting Marshall for an in-person event last summer, and we are so pleased he can join us by video today. To share a bit more about his background, Marshall holds a BA in psychology from Rutgers University and a PhD in clinical psychology from Indiana University. Since 1970, he has been a distinguished member of the psychology faculty at Emory University. Author of more than 100 research articles and 9 books, his research and writings have been written about in the New York Times, Boston Globe, Wall Street Journal, and Parents Magazine, among others. He has appeared on Good Morning America, The Today Show, and The Oprah Winfrey Show, and of course today's webinar. Marshall is the father of 3 and grandfather of 9, so he is blessed with many people to tell family stories to. For those of you who may have just joined us on today's session, I just want to remind you we've got that chat box on the right-hand side of your screen. Please feel free to ask questions throughout the session. And without further ado, we are going to hand things off to Marshall. So we're going to switch over and get his video up here in just a second. So hang in there as we get him up and running on video.
Here I am.
Hello, Marshall.
Hi, how are you doing? Okay. Hello.
Thank you so
Everybody
much.
out in Seattle? Thank you. I hope everybody can see me here. Forgive me for having these headphones on, but it's much clearer when I speak with them than if I just speak into the computer. Okay, so thank you, Lauren, for your kind words, and welcome everyone. I can see we have about 20 people here in this make-believe room, which is kind of fun because I can be here in Atlanta and you can be way out there in Seattle, and I don't have to worry about taking the red eye back, which is what I had to do last time. So I'm going to try and center myself here on the screen and begin about a 30-minute talk on the research that we've done here at Emory and other places on family stories. One of the things that I really like about the Seattle Foundation, before I go even further, is the fact that they are focused on and informed by research. And that's not true of a lot of foundations where they are not using all the up-to-date information available from social science and from other areas. So I loved it when I visited out there during the summer and found that this is a group of people who know what they're doing, both as advisors and helpers in terms of charitable work, but also in terms of the science of what they're doing. So the science of what we're doing here at Emory arises out of an interest that I had many years ago in looking at what makes children stronger. We don't have to go back any further than 2 weeks in this country to realize why we need to know about resilience in children. This started for me when we were doing our research just after 9/11 back in 2001, because it was at that point that suddenly we in the United States realized that we were not going to be able to raise our children without having them deal with very stressful kinds of things. Now, before that, we hoped that we might be able to make it possible for children to grow without too much stress or duress, and that became immediately apparent as an impossible thing in 2001. Luckily, we had some research that had started in 1955, which really spurred the research that we did at Emory, and I want to tell you a little bit about that. Back in 1955, on the island of Kauai in Hawaii, there were 2 social workers named Werner and Smith, and they were interested in the effects of being raised in a disadvantaged environment on children. And in a really kind of remarkable study, they arranged with the government of Kauai to get in contact with the parents of every child born on the island of Kauai in 1955. Now, they were able to do this because they had the cooperation of all of the families and the physicians who were willing to help them. And they decided that they were going to do a long-term study. They were going to follow children who were born in disadvantaged environments, compare them with children who were born into middle-class and upper-class environments, and see what the ultimate effects were of disadvantage, poverty, broken families, things of this sort. that were traditionally seen as conducive to difficulties in childhood and later life. And so they had about 700 children that they followed. And they have, because I only have a short period of time, I can tell you that they've followed them until now. We know what happened to these children through childhood, through adolescence, through their young years, and now well into early old age. We know what happened to them. And the most important thing for me coming out of the research was that there were about 200 children who had disadvantaged backgrounds. But in that group, there were fully a third of them who came through really, really well. They achieved beyond anybody's expectations. They were able to rise above the limitations that were placed on them by accidents of birth or circumstance. So how did this happen? This is the question that I was interested in, and my colleague Robin Fivish here at Emory wanted to learn about. And so we became part of a project called the Center for the Study of Myth and Ritual in American Life, which was funded by the Sloan Foundation here at Emory. And our goal was to see what factors existed in families which seemed to render the children in those families stronger, more resilient, more capable of absorbing the bumps that inevitably hit us in life. And nobody planned the experiment, and God forbid nobody would have planned the experiment, but we had interviewed 40 families in the summer of 2001, and we knew everything there was to know about these families. We had met with them, we had evaluated them, given all sorts of measures and surveys. We knew a lot about them. And what we tried to do was to get to know them as well as we could, but didn't expect that we would have a study of resilience at that point. 9/11 comes along, and we're all shattered by it. And after a few months, we decide that we have a situation which we have to address, and that is that we have what's called a naturally occurring experiment. It's not one which we planned, but there it is. And so we went back to the families, and we tried to find out how they adjusted to 9/11. And we found that the families differed. Some were able to bounce back within a matter of days. Others were continuing to have difficulties months and months after the event. And we began, as psychologists, to ask ourselves what differentiated the families from the ones who had difficulty from the ones who were doing fine. And there were some that were doing fine. And there were many people coming out of 9/11, people who had been in the attack in 9/11, who were coming out fine. Surprisingly, the majority of people who were in the buildings that came down on 9/11 adjusted fairly well over a period of months and do not have long-term impact. So there's something about us as people which renders us resilient. What about the kids? So we did a good bit of research, and we interviewed the families, and we tried to see what made them different. And as a result of a conversation that I had actually with my wife, who's a learning disabilities diagnostician, who works with lots and lots of children, we came up with a hypothesis based upon her observation and corroborated by other clinical psychologists and some psychiatrists that we talked to, that somehow kids who know a lot about their family history seem to be able to bounce back from things. In terms of psychological disorders, they have a better prognosis. If they've got difficulties in school, they seem to be able to overcome them more quickly. So we developed what now become the 20 questions, the do you know scale. Do you know? And essentially we generated 20 questions, the answers to which the children could only have if somebody told them. So this becomes important because it's not, do you remember something that happened to you? Because that doesn't require any kind of information being passed to you. We asked them things like, do you know where your mother and father grew up? Do you know where your grandparents grew up? Do you know the job your grandfather had? Do you know where your parents met? Questions that the kids could not possibly know the answer to unless somebody told them. And we looked at this because it seemed to be the case that there were lots of family stories running around in the families that we had interviewed and had in our study, and some of the stories were kind of unusual stories, things that you wouldn't think about families telling one another, and so we decided to try and make this a little bit more systematic. We gave the Do You Know scale, and we found that the single best predictor of self-esteem, the single best predictor of family functioning, the single best predictor of psychological adjustment, and yes, resilience, was the score on the Do You Know scale. Now, this was kind of surprising because the other measures that we were using were fairly extensive, lengthy, difficult to administer and score, and all we had to do was ask these kids, do you know what school your mother went to? So this became an intriguing thing. How is it that knowing what happens in the history of your family is associated with being more resilient or better adjusted in kids? The first thing that happened to us when we had some publicity about this, which was in the form of a really nice story in the New York Times, I think, in the health section. We got a call from Parents Magazine, and they said to us, could you please tell us what 20 things children have to know in order to be resilient? What are the 20 facts? And here was a classic example, which I teach about in introductory psychology, of confusing causation and correlation. These two things are related. What you know about your family and your level of resilience are in fact related, but it doesn't mean that if you know these 20 things that you're going to be more resilient. So it was more a question for us of how come these kids know so much about their families, and what is the mechanism that creates the resilience on the basis of family knowledge. So we went about trying to examine the families in a little bit more detail, and what we found was that the kids learned about the family histories in certain kinds of circumstances. And just think about it with regards to your family, how you know about the history of your family. You learn about them, the history, when people gather together. When do they gather together? They gather together at birthdays. They gather together at Christmas time, family vacations, and more than anything else, the number one time for families to gather together in the United States is Thanksgiving, when people get together, spend time with one another, and multiple generations are present. So who is it that's been telling these stories, and when are the stories told? It turns out that the primary storyteller, and I want you to think about this just for a moment, guess who it is? 1, 2, 3, guess who it is? It's the grandmother. It turns out that the grandmother, now when I say this, I always get complaints from grandfathers, of which I'm one, who say, I tell stories too. And in fact, it's true. But grandmothers seem to be the ones who the anthropologists refer to as the kin keepers. They tell stories. And somehow grandchildren trust the grandmothers. They trust grandfathers, but grandma's got a special link with the grandchildren. And it turns out that the stories that were being told were not being told in a random manner. In other words, I'm just going to tell you a story. Here, sit down and listen. What we found was that stories that are told are usually told with a purpose. It means that something has come up, something has arisen in the child's life, and the grandmother or the grandparent feels like a story would be helpful. So an example would be, a child says, Grandma, I'm having a lot of trouble in my math class. I can't do math. And the grandmother is likely to say something like, your mother had trouble in math also. And this is what she did. We got a tutor and she worked hard, and usually the story is one in which we have some good outcome and there's a lesson that's taught. Now, the stories that Grandma tells, and again I think many of you will know this, are not necessarily true. They are stories, and sometimes they're made up on the spot. In fact, we know that there are some kids who have heard stories from their grandmothers. If a child comes forward with a math problem, then, your mother had a problem in math. But if the brother or sister comes in and says, well, I'm having trouble in English, your mother had a problem in English. The stories serve a purpose. They are created in order to teach a lesson. And usually the lesson is one based upon some bit of experience, some actual truth, but not necessarily so. We also find that the stories, remember I said, do you know what happened as part of our DYK, or do you know 20 question scale? We checked to see whether it mattered, whether the kids were accurate in what they knew. And it turns out two things. One is that they just have to feel like they know a story and to have a story, but it doesn't necessarily have to be true or accurate. And we also found that members of the same family disagree vehemently sometimes on what really happened. So you have brothers and sisters, aunts and uncles, telling the same story and disagreeing on really the details of it, or even whether or not something happened. So it seems to be that secondarily facts matter, but primarily stories are powerful. So the stories themselves would fall into three basic family story shapes. And when all the stories are said and done and put together, each family, it turns out, has a shape for its family memory. Now, let me tell you just quickly about these, because these are important to know about. One is a family story shape which we would call an ascending family narrative. Now, the word narrative is what we use in the research. It's really a boring word, and it sounds very important, but it's nothing more than a story. The ascending family narrative or story shape is one where we usually have something like, when we came to this country, we had very little. We had nothing. We came with just a few dollars. And what happened is that we worked hard and we improved ourselves and went to school. And the story is one of ascending, moving up from very little to something significant. That's an ascending family narrative. Now, descending family narratives, just the opposite. When we came here, or years and years ago, our family was very well off. We had a business and we were doing well and we lived in a very nice house, but then things like the Depression hit, or a downturn in the economy like 2008 happened, or like what happened today is the stock market has dropped 500 points. So what we have is a story which starts high and then drops down to a lower level. It's a descending family narrative. Now, the third family narrative is what we call the oscillating family narrative. And this is, I can tell you in anticipation, the healthiest of the three. Because what we have here is a story which includes ups and downs. Now, very often parents hesitate to tell a negative story about something that happened in the family. And that's completely understandable. However, it turns out that the thing that creates resilience is knowing that in the history of a person's family, there are ups and downs. So we have children who have heard about businesses being lost, houses burning down, tragedies being reported, car accidents. Even in one family we talked to, there was a murder of someone, and they told the story. But they're also telling the high stories, the up stories. And typically in the oscillating family narrative, what happens is that the children are hearing these stories usually in fine circumstances. It could be Thanksgiving, it could be at a birthday, it could be at a family gathering or vacation. Usually okay, nice times. But they're hearing stories which say, our family was doing very well, and then our family had a problem. And we had to face this problem. And typically the story goes that we found a way to overcome the problem and to come back again. And so what we have is a story of overcoming difficulties, overcoming obstacles, returning to a point where things are good, but knowing that things can go bad again, and typically do. So in the history of the healthiest or most resilient children, they know about ups and downs in the history of their family. Well, are there families who have pure ascending narratives? No. Pure descending narratives? No. Every family, if we really look at them, will have an oscillating family narrative. Now, somebody asked a question, is there a story that's too bad to tell children? Absolutely. And we have to have good judgment when we tell stories to kids. You don't tell every story to every kid at every age. Sometimes they need to be grown-ups before they hear a certain story. There are certain stories that do not go beyond a specific generation. When I was in Seattle, I talked to the folks there about my mother-in-law who had stories that she would not tell about what happened to her and her sisters and brothers during their generation, during their lives. She was the last of the generation, and she simply didn't tell us what happened. We knew some bad things, we knew some good things, but there were some things that died with her. And so there's judgment involved. But can somebody hear about a fairly terrible thing that we were able to overcome? Absolutely. Judgment, and always proper to the child or appropriate to the child. Now, why does this work? What builds the resilience? What transmits family values? Because one of the values that's important to us in any kind of charitable giving, for example, is knowing that we come from a family which values certain things, like values helping other people, or values affecting one's community, and so on. So the mechanism that we finally come to when we looked at the data on the different families was this. A child who knows the history of his or her family develops what we call an intergenerational self. Now, that's like narrative, it's a big fancy word, but intergenerational self merely means this. If I have a 10-year-old child, that child is 10. But if I say to the child, you know, here's what happened to me, your mother or your father, when I was your age, that's like 25 or 30 years before. All of a sudden, the child now has extended himself or herself back 35 years. But what if you hear about something that happened to your grandparents or to your great-parents, your great-grandparents? All of a sudden, your self extends backward in time, perhaps 100 years. In my own case, I know, for example, that my grandfather arrived in the United States in 1872. Now, was I there? No. Do I know him? No. But do I have a sense of extension back there? Yes, I do. And that's because I know his story, and I know some history. And the intergenerational self, it turns out, is the thing that provides stability and strength in the face of difficult situations. Difficult situations, not only being required to overcome something, but also being required to face a situation and make a good decision about it. And this comes out of a kind of a statement that we make to ourselves. What kind of family do I come from? I come from a family which faces obstacles and overcomes them. I come from a family which doesn't make bad decisions like getting in trouble with the law. Or I come from a family which doesn't bring embarrassment to myself or to my extended family. I come from a family that values religion. I come from a family that values charity. And it turns out that the intergenerational self is where the values of a family reside once they are transmitted. And this transmission takes place through the family stories. Now, do we tell the story one time and then the children know it and they're all fixed, they're okay? Absolutely not. I always say that children need to hear the stories over and over and over, to the point where when a situation arises in which a story is going to be told, they say to themselves something like, oh no, they're going to tell me this story about my great-grandfather. They know it's coming. And in fact, the greatest sign of their knowing it's coming is if they roll their eyes up. They go, oh my God, here it comes. Because that means that they now know the story. And not only are they responsible for the story, they're responsible to the story. Meaning that they have some sense of this requirement, this obligation. I know this story. I need to live in a way that reflects my knowledge of the story. I need to be able to transmit the story onward and I need to be able to live in the spirit of the story and live my life according to the values that the story transmits. We can't force our kids to do what we hope they'll do or develop the values that we hope they develop. The best thing we can do is to say, you come from a family which does the kinds of things our family does. And I see the question from one of the participants, how does this affect adopted children? Well, Bruce Feiler, who wrote a story about our work in the New York Times, which is just a really wonderful thing for us, who really put us on the map, essentially. Bruce Feiler says, and it's true for me too, that this is the number one question he always gets whenever he talks about family stories. What about adopted children? Now, I have a blended family. I have 2 biological children. I have 1 adopted child. This was not done for an experiment, I assure you. But it turns out that I do have a sense of this. And the adopted child is given the story of the adopted family. Now, if in time the adopted child learns about the biological family's background, that's great. But the story of the adoptive family, the family that he or she is raised in, becomes his or her story as well. The example that I can give you is if any of you went to a university, for example, when you got to the university where you spent perhaps 4 years, you were given the story of the university. You were given its history. You were given its mascot. You were given all the traditions and the rituals. And it doesn't matter which school you went to, wherever you went, you have that story. It belongs to you. A town has a story. Seattle has a story. Right now, Atlanta is hoping to have a similar story to Seattle with trying to entice Jeff Bezos to come here. However, this is the story of Seattle. Atlanta has a story of the Civil War and of the Civil Rights Movement. And when people move here, even though I wasn't born and raised in Atlanta, and it wouldn't matter, I'd be a Yankee no longer, no matter how long I live here. I own the Civil Rights Movement. I own Martin Luther King's story. These belong to me, to my children. So what happens with the adopted child is that the story is given to him or her, and the same impact holds. That is, it becomes the person who I am, the family that I come from. So I'm seeing that where I am on time, and I want to stop, so be sure that we have enough time for questions. But essentially what I want to say is, in terms of Seattle Foundation and why I think that they asked me to speak to you today, is because the transmission of the family values is something that can't be sort of forced on people. They can't be prescribed. This is what you believe. Clearly and obviously, you have to live your values. That is, you have to do what you want your children to do. You can't say to them, do something that I don't do. One of the things that I always believe is saying to children, listen with your eyes. That is, watch what I do. That's what I'm telling you I want you to do. And so a family can both do what they want the children to do and transmit values in that way also, but also tell the stories of how the family has been living up to its values throughout the generations. And the more generations, the better. And the internet has been amazing in this regard, because we have things like Ancestry.com, and you can find out all kinds of stuff. And the point I would really want to make is, if you find out something that's pretty terrible, the kids might find it to be pretty interesting. Sometimes the odd uncle or the renegade nephew who never got married and went off and did something really irresponsible, sometimes those people become heroes. And sometimes the heroism is not necessarily, I want to do the same thing, but to know that there's a place in a family for all kinds of people. And if you think back at what your grandparents did, I think you'd realize that your stories have heroes in them. Because almost every family in the United States, almost every family, not all of us, have a story of some people picking up and leaving somewhere and coming here, leaving political discomfort or religious persecution of all kinds of reasons. but it's a story of people who are willing to be strong enough to move and to change where they are and to change their circumstances. These are heroic stories. People who came here went through an awful lot of difficulties sometimes to get here. And there are stories that are positive. There are tragic stories. There are people who've gone off to war and not come back. There are people who've gone off to war and come back heroes. All the stories are important and all of them powerful, and they all fit into this oscillating narrative. So I hope that little overview has been helpful to you. I'm going to open up for some questions now. I think that Lauren is going to make that possible. I'm not quite sure.
You should be back. Thank you so much, Marshall. That was so
line
great.
Now. So let me know if you have any questions, or you can type in the questions.
It looks like we do have some questions coming in. It looks like we have one here about kind of the blend of the digital age, if you will.
Yeah, I can see it. About Facebook.
Did you want to tackle that, Marshall, in terms of how in today's technological world we tell stories?
Okay, so the technological world has made a big difference, and I think in many good ways. For one, here I am in Atlanta, and I'm talking to you in Seattle. This means that if you were my grandchildren and you were living in Seattle, all of a sudden we can have a conversation. Things like Skype, FaceTime, all this stuff has made it possible for grandchildren to be able to listen to stories that they might not have as frequently if we were separated as we were in the old days. So this is really good. I think that technology has really helped. I know that my wife, for example, can stalk my grandson to see if he's dating anybody. So it's possible to use these in this way to sort of maintain the connection. However, stories can be transmitted. They can be videotaped. I mean, that's an old term. You know, they can be put on a jump drive or something. They can be saved. They can be edited. They can be maintained. They can become part of a family history. And I think that the technology, for the most part, has been good. It's really brought people together more. Are there bad things there? When you say what happens when the oral tradition diverges from what is easily discoverable online? Well, you know, I'm assuming that you're talking about something personal that maybe somebody could find out about an individual online. The stories are always stories as such, meaning that they're going to vary, and the awareness that stories differ is really important to transmit. And that is, gee, your aunt doesn't remember it this way, but I remember it this way. But I think that face-to-face and grandparent to child or parent to child kind of communication is always most trustworthy. And I hope that that's true, but I don't have data to back that up. So I would say that's what I think. That's my impression. But I know that whenever there's a tape recording found from like 15 or 20 years ago when they had those little diskette tapes and all that stuff, people find these to be treasures, and writings of our relatives, things that they owned. All this stuff becomes really important. So there's a sense of holding on to previous generations. Facebook is going to be, I guess, another way that's
so Marshall, in line with that, in terms of the importance of those telling these stories, do you have any advice to give to folks who find it challenging to share stories with their children or grandchildren? Or have you seen sort of traditions that families may have that really support this? I know you mentioned, around the Thanksgiving dinner table, but what tips might you have for folks practically to take this into their everyday lives?
Okay, yeah, that's a good question. And if a family doesn't have a tradition of telling stories, I think they need to start the tradition of telling stories. Now, you can do this by structuring it, and the 20 questions that we developed and published. By the way, if you want to access the 20 questions, all you have to do is go to Huffington Post, Marshall Duke, put in my name, 20 questions. We published them there because people were writing and asking us about them. Now, as I said, they're not the definitive 20 questions, but what they can be, and many people use them this way, are conversation starters. That is, to sit down and sort of have a game. Let's see who knows what, and ask these questions and see if we can get a conversation going about what happened. Now, usually what comes about there is something called in writing ring composition. So I say something like, you know, I have no hair, I say, and I'll tell my grandchildren this, and then I say, well, you know, how come I don't have it is because my father didn't, and let me tell you about him, but you know, my grandfather didn't either. This always scares my grandsons, I must tell you. But the ring is that you begin making a larger and larger circle around the answer to your question. So suddenly I'm talking to a child about difficulties in math, or overcoming bullying, or dealing with being rejected by a friend, and I begin telling a story of that maybe happening to me, but then I say, oh, it also happened to your cousin, or, you know, it happened in this movie that I saw one time, and the circle or the ring gets bigger and bigger. And the essence of it is to say, look, what's going on with you is part of our family's history. It's part of our community's history, if you will. And there's wisdom about how to deal with these kinds of things. So sometimes you just start somewhere. And different families that we've talked to have generated different kinds of questions. They've got Thanksgiving questions, they've got Christmas questions, they've got birthday questions. But it's only limited by your imagination. The 20 questions that we generated, we used in the research, but they're certainly not sacred in any form. Oh, you put it right up there. Look at that. Wow. Okay, so that's the link to the 20 questions. Thank you, Miss M. I'm not supposed to say your name, I think. Okay, how do you differentiate the impact of shared stories of perseverance leading to resiliency from the possibility that families that tell stories are likely to spend more quality time with their kids and grandkids? Absolutely right. You must be a psychologist or a researcher. You're absolutely right. The sneaky thing about this is that this produces more contact time between grandparents and grandchildren. It certainly does. It produces, I won't use the word quality time because I think there's no difference between quality time and time. So what happens is that, yeah, there's more contact, there's greater interaction, there are stronger relationships, and I believe, and I agree with you fully, I believe if I wrote out just on a piece of paper the stories that I want to tell my grandchildren, and I sent it to them in the mail, and they didn't have it in my voice, then it wouldn't be the same. It wouldn't be the same. I talked to a grandfather who complained to me about saying grandmothers were the kin keepers, and he came up to me after I had given a talk, and he said, in addition to I tell stories too, he said, I was reading a book to my granddaughter, and I read the book, and she was going to bed, and after I read the book, I said, do you want to have one more book? And my granddaughter said to me, this is what the man told me, my granddaughter said to me, tell me a story from your mouth. Tell me a story from your mouth. In other words, don't read me one. I want it from you. And I think that what you're talking about there is the fact that I got this story from my grandparent, or I got the story from my parent, or I got it in the voice of my grandparent. I think that makes a big difference. So just giving the information is not the same as getting it with a lap under you while you're having a cookie with the lady who made it. So yeah, we need to put in the time, and we do need to communicate the stories.
So Marshall, as we might be waiting for any more questions out there to come in, I actually wanted to take a minute and issue one of your questions as a poll to the folks on the line. I'm just kind of curious. So this is one of Marshall's research questions, which is, which person in your family do you act most like? And again, this is not going to be public, so feel free to tell us. Type in your answer out there if you're still with us, who you're acting like. So see father, dad, yeah, lots of dads out there, mother. It's interesting. I certainly have noticed in my husband and I have recently become parents in the last year and a half, and sort of the tendencies that suddenly come out of you. You thought, I'm nothing like my mom, and then suddenly you're chasing after a toddler and you're saying to yourself, I sound exactly like my mother right now. So that's interesting. Well, I'll ask a question here.
Absolutely right. That's a great point.
Oh, go ahead, Marshall. Sorry.
It's sort of like.
Oh, well, I was just going to say, we have a lot of folks on the line joining us today who work as a professional advisor. So folks like me who might be working with families to support them either through their wealth management or their philanthropic management. And do you have any tips for maybe folks who might be in that role of advisor to help support families in this work of storytelling and how they can play a role in that?
Oh yeah, I do, and it's of course going to differ. I'm not a professional in terms of being an advisor, so I can address aspects of it that I think I can be of help with. But in terms of the specifics of what the professionals know, I certainly don't know that. But I do know that relationships are critically important, but that there be some emphasis on the need of the family to really look at where the values are that have been received as well as those that are being transmitted. And to know that age is a critical variable. And why do I say that? Age being a critical variable means that a child of 50 is different from a child of 30. And a child of 15 is different from a child of 25. And so when do we look for the appearance of the values that we hope to encourage or instill in our children? Sometimes you don't see them until, as you just said, until they have children of their own, or until they reach an age at which they begin to realize that they are mortal and that they want to leave some sort of mark on the world. It's been my experience just in talking to various advisors that, and I learn a lot from them, is that I think that we probably might be able to say there are two general classes of people. Now, we should always mistrust people who say there are two classes of anything, but I think there are two general kinds of approaches or mindsets to giving, and one would be the almond people, and the other would be the radish people. And almond people, this is what I grew up with. The almond people are the ones who have a concept of giving, like the planters of the almond trees. I'm going to plant an almond tree, and it's not going to bear fruit or bear anything until long after I'm gone. But I'm planting it for the next generation, just like somebody planted the ones I'm benefiting from now. And that's a very long view. The radish people are sort of like when my children were young and we wanted to have a garden for them. Everybody plants a radish because it's the fastest growing vegetable. And I can have something there in my garden within a matter of a couple of weeks. I have something. And so the radish people are the people who say, I want to do something, but I want to see the result of it very quickly. And I think there's a generational difference here where I think the older generations are more almond kind of people. And this is a generalization, so I just discount that aspect of it. It doesn't apply to everybody all the time. And I think younger people tend to be more radish people. And it may be always that way. It may have always been true. But I think sometimes there are difficulties from one generation to another in agreeing on what to do in terms of affecting the community. They may agree that they want to affect the community, which is one level of value, but how to affect their community may come down to this difference in long-term versus short-term. And I think that the advisors would do well to understand that age is going to be a critical variable. They probably know this already. But if you have a multi-generational family making decisions about the same source of donations or support, you may get some significant disagreements there. And rather than try and achieve, I think, unanimity, I think you have to find a way to address the preferences of everyone involved, some of the radish people and some of the almond people, and see if somehow you can develop a hybrid. Well,
I love that analogy, the almond and the radish people. I might have to take that into the next multi-generational family session I lead to let them know about that. Well, Marshall, I hate to say it, but we're coming towards the end of our wonderful hour with you today. I just want to take a minute to thank you, genuinely thank you for your time and providing us with the space to reflect and hold our individual and family stories. We are going to wave goodbye to you at this point. I'm going to switch over to a couple wrap-up slides to close things out today. But again, thank you to all of you, and a big thank you to Marshall. We really appreciate it. I mean, I'm just feeling so grateful to be part of this work with all of you, to be part of this community here in Greater Seattle, and to get to support this. Well, and as Marshall shared, philanthropy can be a powerful tool for passing down your family stories and really living your values. And as I shared earlier, Seattle Foundation is a leader in the field of family philanthropy, and we have a range of services available to support you in advancing your philanthropic and community impact goals. Over the past 10 years, we've developed a field-leading giving curriculum called Giving with Impact. Facilitated by our world-class advising team, Giving with Impact leads your family through a series of guided conversations and interactive exercises to support the development and implementation of your strategic giving plan. We also offer support with succession planning, next generation engagement, and legacy planning. Another program that we offer that I wanted to make sure you all know about is our Youth Grant Making Board. This is a leadership program open to any high school sophomore through senior in King County, and it provides students with the opportunity to learn about community needs and lead a grant cycle in an issue area that they select. So it's a fabulous program. It generally runs January through spring. If you're interested in learning more about any of our services or programs, please visit our website at seattlefoundation.org or just reach out to us. And as a little thank you for joining us today, we have a handy flip book to help you get started with sharing family stories. The book includes Marshall's 20 questions that he uses in his research, as well as 10 questions developed by Seattle Foundation to help you think about your philanthropic stories. We have a limited number of these available, so please reach out to your philanthropic advisor if you're already a partner with us, or reach out to us by this information here on the screen if you'd like to receive one. We'll also be sending you an email in the coming days with a short link to a survey, or I should say a link to a short survey. We'd really appreciate your feedback on today's webinar and as we plan out the rest of our activities for the year. So please take a minute to fill that out. Thank you again to Marshall Duke for joining us and sharing his research and insights with all of us today. And thank you for your time and participation. I wish you all a wonderful rest of your day. And my challenge to you right now, all of you, is to find someone to share a story with today at some point. So maybe around the dinner table tonight, but my challenge for you to take forth from today's webinar is to share a story. So thank you all again, and we hope to see you around Seattle Foundation soon. We're going to sign off now. Thanks.